welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitriy Kalyagin, and I am back from what feels like an extremely long absence from the show. Most people that are following us on social media know where I was in Cyprus and on Mount Athos, and we're going to be talking about a little bit of that today here on our, our eighth Q&A, something like that. We are here to answer more of our supporter questions. If you want to ask a question and be included in the next Q&A, be sure to get behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co. All of that is in the description wherever you happen to be listening to this, so be sure to get behind the paywall and support the show and get your questions answered on a monthly basis when we do these Q&As. But with all of that, we're going to dive into some of these questions. It's good to be back. Dmitry, how are you doing? Good job holding down the fort in my absence.
Thank you, Conrad. You were missed very much, and I think having you back here, look, we'll get started with this massive Q&A, and the first question, of course, is towards you by Andrew. Conrad, you are in Cyprus right now, which has changed much over the past several decades with overdevelopment and commercialization on the Greek side. Has this resulted in a noticeable degradation of the Orthodox faith there, or are the Cypriots still largely practicing compared to other Europeans? I suppose he means practicing Christians.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'll kind of give everybody the lay of the land when it comes to Cyprus. It's extremely small. It's not a very big country. And of course, the fact that it's split down the middle with the whole UN buffer zone and the Turkish side and the Greek side, all in that more rural area, there's not a whole lot going on as well. But we went around the whole island, at least the Greek side. We were in Limassol briefly, which is the Russian area. We stayed in Paphos, which is the second largest town. That's where Metropolitan Tychikos is, who in many ways the Metropolitan of Paphos is often considered the obvious successor to the Archbishop of Cyprus. We were flying into Larnaca, that's where the airport is, because the Nicosia airport, Nicosia being the capital of Cyprus, the airport was in the disputed zone and has been destroyed. It's not functional. So the island in general is super interesting. But as far as piety goes, there's a whole lot of churches. There's a whole lot of different Orthodox sites that you can see, and everywhere you go, you'll see statues of Archbishop Makarios III, which ironically probably isn't as much of a pious thing as you might think, because he was the first president of Cyprus, even though he was an archbishop and everything. So it's a very interesting place, one of the most interesting places I've ever been. Very warm, even warmer than Greece and Mount Athos, although slightly less humid. It's drier, which was interesting, but I went to some of the most beautiful and holy monasteries I'd ever been to in many ways, because I wasn't expecting it in the same way you're expecting it on Athos. Some of the places I visited in Cyprus I felt were almost more holy. I mean, Panagia of Jerusalem was this monastery that we went to in that place. I'll probably post more about it online and discuss it more in the future. It was a really amazing place, so I have a lot of things to say about that. But again, much like Greece, you go to services. We went to a service it wasn't on a Sunday or anything, so it was a weekday service, and there was probably, I don't know, at the end of it, maybe 40 people there, so not a whole lot of people, but it also wasn't a Sunday morning, I don't think, so it was a bit of a different situation, so I can't judge all of the attendance. But in many ways, yeah, it's a very secular place. Obviously, most people are there on vacation to go to the beach and everything. It's very similar to Greece in that regard, but at the same time, there is a lot of popular piety all around. I mean, there's respect for all sorts of local saints and the Apostle Barnabas and other biblical characters that have been through Cyprus, because Cyprus is really more of a Middle Eastern Levantine country than it is, Greek. I mean, ethnically and historically it's Greek, but as far as geographically, it's pretty much part of the Middle East. And I would say in certain capacities, it's probably more nationalistic and Orthodox than Greece because of their proximity to Muslims and Turks. But at the same time, it is also literally occupied by the United Kingdom. It's also in the European Union, and the United Nations has a big presence there, and it is very much secularized, so it has many of the same problems as Greece as well. And there's no Mount Athos on Cyprus, although I went to some places that were very similar, like I just said. And of course, getting to meet Metropolitan Neophytos, going to Evrichou, where the metropolis of Morphou is located, was wonderful. So I'm obviously biased towards Cyprus because everybody I was meeting there was very Orthodox, very holy, very pious. So it was quite the experience. Metropolitan Neophytos is a huge man, just a huge individual, both spiritual presence and physically. He's a very, very large guy, and his metropolis is a very wonderful, well-kept place. They fed us some delicious fish, and he spoke to us for hours. He didn't have to do that. He gave us his time that, I think he just wanted to speak with us, and he gave me some wonderful gifts, and it was really a life-changing experience, I would say. Of course, he only speaks Greek, and not just Greek, but a lot of ancient Greek interspersed. So my good friend Gregory Hears, who, the son of Father Peter Hears, he was translating for me. And when he had to leave, somebody else who was less well versed in ancient Greek was translating, and they all sorts of words that Metropolitan Neophytos would say, they would be like, "Oh, I missed that one because it's ancient Greek." So I know Cypriot Greek already has more ancient Greek in it, but Metropolitan Neophytos also, I think, just throws those words in there, and that's how he talks. So that was quite the wonderful experience. He talked to me all about experiences he has had in Cypriot politics, how ultimately Cyprus is totally run by the Zionists as its proximity to Israel, 15-minute flight. So he tapped him into a lot of things about the situation in Cyprus, of course, about how their future will have to be evangelizing the Turks once World War III is underway and finishing up. Of course, he believes that the Turks will actually leave northern Cyprus. So I'll probably get more into details on some of that in a future question. But yeah, that's my answer to Andrew on his Cypriot question. I guess following up on that, we have Allegiant Dissident, who said, recently saw a clip from a YouTube channel called The Holy Wisdom of His Eminence Metropolitan Neophytos, recounting a prophecy about a civil war in America beginning in 2024, which would end with a great earthquake along the West Coast. Are you familiar with this specific prophecy? And do you think the 2024 election is going to be the catalyst for this to occur? I don't know exactly the talk about the Civil War and everything, but the idea that the election and the situation in America would get extremely dire before what we know with the Jewish strike on the Iranian nuclear capabilities and the potential for, again, St. Cosmas of Aetolia talked about how there could be a situation that unfolds from the south and a situation that unfolds from the north. The north situation being worse. The Metropolitan Neophytos told me that this means, kind of the Ukraine, Russia, Europe situation as opposed to the Israel, Palestine, Persia situation. And he even told me that if the Ukraine situation is to escalate to where that would fulfill the criteria for St. Cosmas's prophecy being, the northern front situation, that would involve Russian strikes on Scandinavia and Sweden and other countries in the north of NATO, whereas it seems that right now it's more likely that the Jews striking the Iranian nuclear capability is more likely, and there are talks specifically from Elder Ephraim, St. Joseph the Hesychast even, and others about geophysical phenomenon that will happen in America coinciding with this. Of course, Erdogan falling, in Turkey and the rise of Kemalists, and then, of course, what many have said is this big fault line and earthquakes in California that would cause most of California to sink into the ocean. We know that Elder Ephraim talked about how Life-Giving Spring and other monasteries out, perhaps in the Sierra Nevadas would be like islands surrounded by water after what goes on, and this could lead to volcanic eruptions, thinking of like Rainier and Yellowstone and others, although I don't think any of those volcanoes were specifically prophesied by any holy people. But I was just talking about Cyprus. That's one thing at all of the monasteries I went to. Elder Ephraim was widely beloved. Pictures of icons of him were everywhere. At Panagia of Jerusalem, they had a whole chapel dedicated to Elder Ephraim with some of his vestments there for veneration, and they also kept the jawbone of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite behind the iconostasis at the chapel they had dedicated to Elder Ephraim, which was pretty amazing. I was not expecting the abbot to just come out with that in his hands, the jawbone of Saint Dionysius. And they had other amazing relics at that monastery as well, a thread of Christ's robe, relics of Saints Joachim and Anna, relics of Saint Alexander's sphere, all sorts of others. So quite a wonderful place. Again, follow us on the socials to see everything. I'm not using this to shill the social media. I just want everybody to actually see some of these things that I saw because it was truly life-changing. So again, thank you to Father Peter and Orthodox Ethos and everything for the opportunity to go on the pilgrimage. I'm sure we'll be talking to him in the future, and we are going to be talking to Gregory in the very near future for part 2 of the St. John Vatatzis episode. I know people asked that in the Q&A thread, so that's now been answered. But yeah, Dmitry, I guess I want to get your thoughts, perhaps. I know you've been translating Russia during the Second Coming and some of these other prophetic works. And I know you've also, of course, been keeping up with Metropolitan Neophytos, as many other Russian channels have as well. We know the TASS interview and some of these other... talking to Metropolitan Neophytos, he loves Russians. He's very good friends with many Russian, spiritual figures and monastics and priests and everything. And he has a lot to say because Cyprus has a very large Russian population and has historically been in the Russian sphere of influence of things. And he had a lot of wisdom in that regard. So I'm wondering your thoughts on, obviously, American politics in regards to that, but also just World War III and prophecies in general.
Well, I think there's definitely a risk of creating a rift within American society that will result in certain skirmishes and local conflicts. We can see America today is very much divided to the point where even the New World Order, the globalists running America and running some of the elite institutions in the United States are actually working on downplaying the Republican Democrat differences in order to level out the situation, because I think they still require America as this vehicle of spreading globalism and other, shall we say, liberal values for a bit longer. So they actually perhaps even want to prevent the so-called civil war from even taking place, and thus you see even Donald Trump's campaign, for example, downplaying some of their right-wing rhetoric to the point where, Trump's speaking out in favor of abortions, just verbally speaking, in order to, lower the level of animosity between himself and some of the liberals opposing him. And, in foreign policy as well, very much Democrats and Republicans are almost aligned, on questions of the Middle East and things of that nature. And Trump has openly said that he's friends with Zelensky, things of this nature. So you can kind of see where this is going. But again, the people on the ground, I think the regular people in the United States are definitely looking at one another as based on each other's political affiliations more and more so. And this is, I think, has been growing since at least 9/11, but definitely since 2016. It's been getting a lot more divided. So, these clairvoyant sayings and thoughts about American politics, I don't think they're necessarily wrong. I think it's more of a look forward. And I mean, the globalists themselves are predicting this in their Hollywood depictions, like that film that came out earlier this year, Civil War, which was a trash movie. It made some good clips, but generally speaking, even they anticipate some sort of agitation on the ground level, I think domestically within the United States, unfortunately, because a lot of the situation of immigration and things of that nature, gun rights, are getting to, this debate is getting very, very heated amongst the general populace. This next question, actually, from Orphanon. If this has been already touched on, forgive me, I haven't listened to every single episode. There have been many more prophecies discussed on this show, but has there ever been a discussion about what prophecies actually are and how they work? It may be helpful to have a priest or an expert on the subject to speak to. It is my understanding that prophecies act almost like warnings, in that we need to heed the words of the one that speaks them and repent, so that we can delay or change through God's grace what has been prophesied. If this is the case, as Orthodox Christians, what is the proper response to the prophecies that have been mentioned on the show? How should each one of us take action, especially regarding prophecies that specifically mention our nations or nation? Thank you. Great question, Orphanon. And as Conrad said earlier, I think Russia Before the Second Coming, especially the first two chapters, specifically chapter 1, speaks about the nature of prophecies. There's lots of course, allusions and excerpts taken from the Old Testament wherein we see prophecy and clairvoyant sayings about the New Testament actually foretold many, many times, and it describes exactly what prophets are and how the Lord actually speaks to them and uses them as his instruments in sort of calling certain people or peoples to repentance. And that's, I think, most importantly, when a prophecy is about definitely a negative event such as a calamity, a civil war, or a conflict, or perhaps a natural disaster of sorts, like the fall of Nineveh, for example. These events can be delayed for repentance. I think that's probably the most important thing. Russians did not heed this warning at the beginning of the 20th century. St. John of Kronstadt, for example, gave many of his sermons contained clairvoyant predictions about the future, about the revolution of 1917 and the events that will take place afterwards. Alas, many people did not listen to him, and so these things definitely did come to pass. The entire Russian nation did not repent, did not lose its sort of trend of apostasy, and thus they allowed these wolves to take over and definitely rend the nation and tear it apart and slay the catechon, the anointed of God, Tsar Nicholas II, and his family. So absolutely taking heed of the prophecies, using them for purposes of repentance in order to actually understand that God's will still acts in the world is very much important. It'd be good to have a guest on who speaks about it. I believe we spoke about prophecies partially with almost every single guest that we've had from the Orthodox clergy, Conrad, if I'm not mistaken, over the past year and a half. So we have mentioned it briefly, but I think in your particular case, I would recommend reading Russia Before the Second Coming, because even chapter 3, which I recently released, which was quite a lengthy chapter, does discuss how even Nikon himself had this very strange prophecy regarding his relationship with Tsar Alexei I, in the middle of the 1600s. And what's really interesting is that Nikon had this dream during the all-night vigil, and it's not quite, you can't really tell from the dream that he had, whether or not the dream was from God or not. But Nikon definitely believed it was from God. So again, there's this issue of prelist as well. When powerful people have visions, dreams, things like that, it's not always a good idea to actually follow along and to actually believe in that particular prophecy or clairvoyant vision that you've had or that you've listened to. It's always good to speak to your spiritual father and actually align it with them. Always take everything you hear through an orthodox filter. This is what we kind of advocate on the show, Conrad. I think any sort of geopolitical news, don't let it cast you into despair. Always make sure that you align it with what you already know about Orthodox Christianity and, through some of the people that already guide you through the faith, depending on which stage you're at, if you're a catechumen, if you're already several years into the faith. So I think that's probably the best advice. But definitely keep reading Russia Before the Second Coming. There'll be a few more chapters coming out this year, so we'll definitely keep you updated on that.
And I'll tie this in with Allegiant Dissident's other question he asked about. He said, Elder Theodore of Crete's prophecy about Israel's strike on Iran's nuclear program makes it sound as though it will catch us somewhat off guard. Perhaps Iran's inaction in response to the recent assassinations is to be expected then, and we will then see a frustrated and bloodthirsty Israel suddenly resort to this more extreme means of attempting to bring about the full-on war they so desperately want. What are your thoughts? I addressed that a little bit earlier, and I think that's some pretty good analysis. Like I said, it could easily come about. We know Israel are the ones that actually want aggression. Iran is playing it extremely safe because they know at the end of the day that the U.S. is not on their side and the U.S. still holds the whip hand. So it makes a lot of sense. And regarding the understanding of prophecies that also addresses this specific prophecy, ironically enough, we'll be sure to link the Understanding Prophecies video from Metropolitan Neophytos where he kind of answers this question and says a lot of what Dmitry just said and a lot of, I'm sure, what is said in Russia and the Second Coming, because he talks about how many prophecies can change and examples of how things had changed in the past, both in the scriptures and in his own prophetic experience with the saints and whatnot. So we'll be sure to have that linked. I'll reply that to you, Ortho Anon. That'll be in the thread for anybody that wants to see it. But we got to get through a lot of these questions. We have a good question here from our good friend Alexander Suvorov, who says, I found Orthodoxy through a defrocked old calendar bishop who popped up in my rural town. He had been a part of a cult called the Holy Order of Mans, which was received into the Father Herman Podmashensky Vasilopoulos Synod. Numbers-wise, this seems to be the second or third largest conversion in modern U.S. history, next to the Evangelical Orthodox Church and maybe Rokor letting in the Old Rite. Do we know anything else about this? Did a lot of these HOMS people make it into the canonical church when Platina ended the schism 2 decades ago? Why doesn't anybody talk about this mass conversion? Please pray for the soul of this well-meaning bishop who started my journey. His name was Kirill. I have a decent bit to say about this because a priest friend of mine who was actually tonsured or reader at a Bulgarian Orthodox parish by the current patriarch of Bulgaria, Daniel. His parish, in many ways, had a lot of people that were from the Holy Order of Mans in it, and their parish has a monastery in western Massachusetts directly connected to their parish that is run by 2 hieromonks that are former members of the Holy Order of Mans, and they went over to Bulgaria and were made novices and eventually were made monks and priest monks and are now, the liturgists and the respective abbots of this monastery out in Massachusetts. And they have a lot of saintly people that have gone through that parish, and in many ways I've seen a lot of good fruits from the Holy Order of Mans, despite some of the circumstances being a bit interesting. I don't know if you know anything about this, Dmitry.
Yeah, no, Father Herman Podmashensky, I did listen to some of his lectures back in the day, and, he has decent exegesis. Again, it's just this wariness we should have about, people who have gone into schism, and just understanding that perhaps some of their teachings on ecclesiology is typically either wrong or tainted in a certain capacity, whereas the actual theology and that they have is, people who were once members of the Orthodox Church, their theology is usually completely aligned, right? And I would say the same for most likely Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, those of the the non-canonical Ukrainian church, for example, Metropolitan Epiphany, right? I'm sure, despite the fact that he's literally a LARPing layman pretending to be a bishop, you do have the, if you have a look at his theology, it's most likely like 98, 99% Orthodox, despite the fact that there is that 1 or 2% difference wherein he would sacrifice not just theology, but his clear understanding of ecclesiology and even church history. And in fact, just probably argue in bad faith that his church is legitimate. And this is, I think, troublesome because, as we know, the devil is a liar, and simply to make things up about the faith, to claim that the Orthodox Christian jurisdictions with grace are wrong and should not be attended, I think is already a large enough problem. This is similar to, breaching other, statements of dogma and going against the faith, canonically speaking. And again, the church canons are there to definitely guide these hierarchs first and foremost, and clergy, and of course the laity as well. And so if clergymen are not explicitly not following the canons, it definitely says a lot about them and what kind of spiritual fruits they may bear. So it's quite a big warning. Regarding this mass conversion, I have heard about it. The details are a little bit obscure, but I think the reason why this wasn't publicized, Conrad, as well, was that especially 1980s onwards, a lot of these mass conversions from Protestantism or other sects in the US, there was also this, I think, view from ROCOR and other American churches that, well, these people mass convert, but how long exactly will they stay in the faith? It was also a big test of the current catechism courses that they had at the time available to various priests and parishes in which these people entered. And so there was this understanding of, okay, let's not necessarily celebrate too early, and let's not announce it that, wow, we had this massive conversion, hundreds of people in this region, thousands in this region, because people actually need to invest. Orthodoxy is not just the one-time conversion, it's also actually sustaining the faith and actually living in it, which the risk was that these people would fall away, and that's probably why. And again, also spreading news about schisms and perpetrating these sort of some of these dramatic scandalous events around Platina and other places was also not popular in those pre-internet times. Today, unfortunately, with the internet, it's more like when a scandalous or schismatic event takes place, like in Ukraine, like after 1918 in the Ukrainian church, we almost necessarily need to speak about it, not because we're advertising it, but because we're actually providing disclaimers and explaining why so-and-so event is wrong. Sort of hiding the news about a certain schism and not discussing it in the open with transparency, which I think is probably a good strategy, is even more problematic, because the internet has unlocked many sort of things which perhaps people would have preferred to keep hidden. So there's a very much a new approach to how church news is spread and dealt with, I think, in various jurisdictions. And this next question, I think, is very, very similar, because we have a question from Nicholas. Hope you both have been well. There's been a whole deal of the Matthewite schismatics. How did it all come to this? God bless. I'll just briefly answer. So the Matthewite schismatics, this was a priest monk Matthew, who essentially schismed away from another group of old calendarist Greeks, and this is in the early 20th century, so 1920s, 1930s, and this priest monk Matthew was inside of the old calendarist community, this particular jurisdiction that was created to oppose Meletios Metaxarchus and some of the sort of early 20th century Freemason changes to a lot of the Southern Balkan Orthodox Church jurisdictions. He was then promoted to the rank of bishop. Now, as you may understand, somebody who's a priest monk already, and archimandrite, somebody in those particular priest monk ranks, already knows church administration leadership to some extent, and so it may appear safe to promote him to perform the laying of hands ceremony and to make him a bishop in the church. Unfortunately, this priest monk Matthew was definitely the wrong person, because he fell not into such deep prelace that he ended up schisming away from the original old calendarists and actually creating his own very zealous sect. And these people actually began calling even the original old calendarists graceless. And their particular approach was that everyone who was in schism is also therefore in heresy. And they started teaching that the Russian Orthodox Church, the Catacomb Church, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, all these various jurisdictions are also, and of course, naturally, the Greek Church, the Ecumenical Patriarch, they're all heretics, just simply by aligning themselves with any other church of the new calendar. They kind of believed schism and heresy was this disease that would spread through commemoration. It was very much sort of early church heresy, which was, again, reappeared in the early 20th century. And this priest monk Matthew definitely was spreading it. So his sect was very, very zealous, very much against the church. And I think the worst thing he did, Conrad, was he actually he actually appointed bishops by himself, which goes against the early canons. You need several bishops to perform the ceremony of consecrating another bishop, and he was actually consecrating bishops himself, one to one, allegedly transferring the grace of the Holy Spirit and making new bishops. So he kind of created his own breakaway basement church, which to this day I think functions in some capacity, but it has maybe several thousand members at most across the Western world. So thank God that has kind of ended. But this kind of shows you in a Protestant type fashion what happens after a major schism is that many more schisms just shatter off, and there are sects of very extreme people who break off and they just want to be even more extreme, and they just bring church scandal up to several degrees and definitely cause more trouble. Unfortunately, priest monk Matthew was exactly that type of a person in the Greek Orthodox world.
Yeah, the Matthewites are, of course, considered, the extreme versions of the old calendar as schismatics. Currently at Esphigmenou Monastery on Mount Athos, they're one of the 5 factions represented within the Esphigmenou extended universe. The schismatics that all, despite disagreeing with each other on a number of things, decide to all, put their differences aside and specifically have this. This one monastery with 100+ monks, because they're all there. It's one of the bigger monasteries, actually, as far as population of monastics go. But unfortunately, the Matthewites are the more odious bunch. They have, saints that are effectively like serial killers that have killed people in the past and all sorts of other horrible, terrible things. Many other old calendarists that had more direct affiliations with Rocor and whatnot have, less troubled and you could say more redeemable and understandable histories, but we're not going to get into that. This is not an old calendarist channel, but we have some questions next from Vladimir Balonogov asks, are there any prophecies concerning the mass Muslim and other immigration into the previously Christian West and even into Russia itself? And also, what are your thoughts on the prophecies of Hierom Martyr Constantius in light of current events? So, Dmitry, I know you have something to say specifically about that first one.
Yeah, definitely. I had a look through a lot of the books which I had, a lot of the bookmarks. There were early prophecies about some of the Islamic conquests of the Byzantine age, but as we know, those have already come to pass. And, a lot of the Near East, a lot of the former Byzantine Roman Eastern Empire has already been conquered by Islam to a large extent. So really not worth mentioning those, right? But in terms of the Islamic spread over Europe, this mass immigration, I think sort of one of the gateways into Europe, which is the Balkans, the southern Serbs, the land of the Yugoslavs, it's good to kind of have a look at as to what their hierarchs were saying. And one of their most holiest hierarchs in recent years in the 21st century, Patriarch Pavel of Serbia, on Easter, he gave a very interesting sermon on the 24th of April 2008, wherein he repeated the testament of Saint Prince Lazarus, who fought at the Battle of the Kosovo Fields, a very major battle in Serbian history in the 14th century. And the testament was, the earthly kingdom is for a moment, but the heavenly kingdom is forever. And he repeated this, and then he says, the powers of this world want to collectively execute the Orthodox Serbian people. They want to break and erase them, to turn them into a faceless mass, to tear out their heart from within. By submitting to the will of Christ, we bear witness to their lawlessness, their hypocrisy, which remind us of how Pilate washed his hands, stained with the blood of the righteous one. And so Patriarch Paul, in this 24th of April 2008 sermon, actually goes into the fact that the powers of the world, these are the liberals, the New World Order, NATO, ultimately run by probably members of the Talmudic Kagal around the world, are actually looking to erase not just Serbians, but also, I would say, this particular sermon applies to almost every European nation, beginning with the Serbians, who are probably, if you look at the European Union, but if you take out all the Eastern European countries, the other ones, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Serbia is probably the largest Orthodox Christian country in terms of populace on the European continent. And it does make sense that inside of their church, there would be these prophecies that appear about, say, the Ekologi plan, this plan of erasing European and Christian identity. And in fact, I think this is what Patriarch Paul is alluding to here, because the powers of the world, notice he doesn't mention Islamic immigration as the main issue. He clearly identifies that it is a particular overarching evil that is planning this erasure of the Serbian people and the Orthodox Christian identity from the lands of the Southern Balkans. And again, I think this other quote from him from an unnamed year, but this is a very well-known quote from Patriarch Paul, kind of underlines this issue of Europeans being replaced, because again, it's not just they're being replaced because of how evil the Muslim immigrants are. It's mostly again caused by their own lukewarmness and their own non-reactive state to what is actually taking place around them. This quote is, "If an Albanian woman gives birth to 7 children and a Serbian woman has 7 abortions, then this land, that is the land of Kosovo, is more needed by the Albanians than by the Serbs." So, fairly strong quote. It does make sense, and it kind of explains as to this sort of anti-natalist, anti-baby, anti-family rhetoric going around Europe, and has been perpetrated and pushed by liberal propaganda, which unfortunately a lot of European people, including Orthodox Christian Serbians, have fallen for across Europe. And this will be one of those weapons that the New World Order and globalists will use against Christians all across Europe, whether it's Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Catholics. Just wanted your thoughts on this, Conrad. I think definitely this is exactly what's taking place, but it's hard to find specific prophecies because Orthodoxy is very much in an infantile state in a lot of Western countries, wherein Catholicism, atheism, and Protestantism still dominate. So we don't actually have clairvoyant sayings of saints from those particular regions, like Germany, France, the United Kingdom.
Thank you so much for listening to this free preview of this Ether Hour Q&A. We gave you a decent amount, solid 30 minutes there, but if you get behind that paywall, you'll listen to the rest of our discussion about these prophecies and World War III and the potential for the strikes on Iran's nuclear program and many other situations. I talk a little bit more about my trip to Cyprus and Mount Athos. We also get into some issues with the Volga Germans, Baron Ungern. We talk about the Domostroi. We talk about some of the future issues that could be going on in the UOC as Ukraine and the war there goes a certain way. So with all of that, we want to thank you all for listening. If you want to get behind that paywall, it really helps support the show. That's worldwarnow.co. Everything's linked below. If you're on Substack, you'll be able to sign right up. So again, thank you so much for listening, and God bless. We'll see you on the other side.